Hello Booktube, my name is Elizabeth. Welcome or welcome back to my channel, Book as in Books. This video is all about statistics of my reading year in 2024. Now, I know a lot of people don't like to associate reading with statistics. For my part, I don't mind because I don't do that in a competitive way or in a as a way to check my productivity. That's not the point. I want to have a portrait, a picture of what I've read, and I think statistics can be a good tool to have a global look at what I've read this year. So this is not about it's not about the numbers. It's about what the numbers show, and that's it. So it's just to have fun. If you don't like it, skip the video. I'll go back to more regular book talk in the next videos. But if you like it, stick around. There's plenty of pie charts. So we'll start with the number of books that I read, because that is the king or the queen or the emperor, empress, whatever, of all reading stats. It's number of books. Is it a reliable statistic? No, it is not, because there's book. Wait. That count as a book that I've read this year. So there's book and then there's book. This one I haven't read. So, it can mean different things. Again, number of pages, is that a better, more reliable stat? Then again, not necessarily, because that's a page. So it doesn't mean much. It's really just for the fun of it. So number of books that I've read this year. To my great surprise, I've reached 100, because I started the year by not reading much and I ended the year by not reading much. But apparently in between, I read quite a bit. I read 103 books, 103. The length of the books count a little bit. So I've read 26 books that were under 250 pages. So that's about a quarter of what I read was under 250 pages. And then most of the books I read were between 250 and 500 pages. In fact, they were probably between 250 and 400 pages. I haven't seen a lot of books at 430 pages or 480 pages when I compiled the stats. So most of them were around, let's say, 350 pages. So that's 71 books. So that's almost, I've read 103 books. So the number of books is pretty much the percentage. And then I've read a few books that were between 500 and 1,000 pages. That's 5 books. In fact, they were between 500 and 650 pages. I didn't read anything that was 750. However, I did read one book that was over 1,000 pages, and that one was Les Miserables, that I read with Anne from the channel Anne Novella and Micah Cummins for Classics and Company in April. So it was 1,000. It was over. I don't have the exact number. Darn. It was 1,600 and something pages. So the edition that I had was in 3 volumes, and all 3 volumes were well above 500 pages. So it was 1,600 and something pages. So that was a big book. And the total number of pages that I read was 33,475. I don't have the number for last year, but I am under the impression that it's a lot less than last year. I think last year I was at about 120 books, and I was at around 40 or 42,000 pages read. So I think there's a significant number of pages that I read less this year. So let's continue with the stats. Let's go with genre. I read 68 fiction and 35 nonfiction. So that's about 2/3 fiction for 1/3 nonfiction. However, in the fiction department, exactly half of it was romance. And that is the big difference compared to the previous years. Compared to the previous years, in 2023, I think I read maybe a dozen romance, maybe 20, something like that, like 1 or 2 a month. And in the year before that, I was rediscovering romance. So I just read about a dozen of it, if I remember correctly. I didn't check. But this year, it was a lot. And the reason is that romance became sort of my go-to genre for stress relief. It was a stressful year. Still not entirely over, but things are going to be just fine in March, I think. By March, things are going to be just fine, both at home and at work. So last year was a combination of multiple things that made me want to reach for very calming and soothing reading, and romance did the job for me. Very soothing, very a lot of escapism in it. Just I'm not here, I'm reading a romance, I'm in Jane Austen, I am in Regency England, I'm not here. And that was a quick rush of dopamine, and it was just perfect. So yeah, that's the reason why I think I managed to read so many books this year. It's because there was a lot of romance in there, and it's easy to read. It reads quickly. Apologies for the break. I was a bit lost in my documents because I just noted quickly on some sheets of paper, and I did not organize it before I decided to film. So that's the result. So next, statistics, language, because I read in 2 languages, as you probably know. The title of my channel, Bouquin, means books in French. So I'm reading in French and in English. And this year I read 31 books in French and 72 in English. And that includes 4 months where I did not read a single book in French. So in February, March, June, and October, I did not read a single book in French. And I think I felt it because in November and December, of the 31 books that I read in French, 10 of those were in the last 2 months of the year, and it felt so good to read in French. So that's something that I want to focus on in 2025. I want to read more in French because I need it. It's good for me. It's good for my soul. I want to read more in French. So I'm going to try to prioritize that for next year. However, the original language of the books, they were 29 were originally written in French, 68 were originally written in English, and then there were only 6 in other languages. I read very little literature in translation this year, and that is not typical of what I read. Normally, I read a lot more world literature than I did this year. So the translated books that I read, 2 of them were translated from Babylonian. That means that I read 2 different translations of Gilgamesh. One was a translation from ancient Greek because I read a play by Euripides. It was Medea. One is a translation from the Chinese. That one was Love in a Fallen City by Eileen Chang. One was a translation from the Italian. That was the memoir In Other Words by Jhumpa Lahiri. And there was one translation from the Swedish. It was An Elderly Lady is Up to No Good, which is a mystery, I guess. It's a collection of short stories that involve crime, and we know already who did it, but the question is, will the person get caught or not? It was a lot of fun. So that's the only books in translation that I read. And it's the first year in I don't know how many years that I did not read any Russian literature. It's the first year in I don't know how many years that I did not read Japanese literature. It's not that I am particularly into Japanese literature, but it just happens that I always end up reading something that was originally written in Japanese, and this year it did not happen. In Russian, though, generally it's an interest of mine, so normally I would have read at least one Dostoevsky or one Turgenev or one something of the sort, but this year I did not. So again, that is something I'd like to go back to in 2025 because I feel that there's something missing in my reading, and that was the world. The world was missing world literature because I included the world in a different way, but more on that later. On what support did I read? So what sort of books did I read? 87 were books that I read on paper. So that is by far and large the dominating way. My preferred way of reading is to read paper books. So that's 87. I read 12 ebooks and I listened to 3 audiobooks. And then there were 3 more that were a combination of either paper and ebook. So that meant that I had the paper book when I was here, and when I was going somewhere, let's say at the office or in a cafe, I was reading the ebook version. And there are 2 cases of combination of audiobook and paper. And it's not that I was reading the book while listening to the audiobook. It was that while I was driving, I was listening to the audiobook, and when I got to my destination, I was reading the paper book. Or when I was back home, I was reading the paper book. So I did that for the Booktube prize to accelerate the reading of certain books that perhaps I was not that interested in. So the audiobook meant that I could read it faster. Then the source of my books. Where did I get them from. So 68 books were my own books, so physical books that I had. 27 books were from the library. So the 68 books, they were all paper books. I don't include ebooks in there. I don't own ebooks. 27 were from the library. That could mean either ebooks that I borrowed or physical books that I borrowed or audiobooks. And I read 7 on Everand. So these ones are ebooks or audiobooks. And there were 4 from other sources. And these ones were ebooks because they were either from Project Gutenberg or NetGalley. So that's the 4 others. What else? Rereading. In 2024, well, no, I'm going to start in 2023. At the end of 2023, I hosted a readathon, which was called Remember December, which was all about rereading. It was about inviting everyone to discover or to indulge in the joy of rereading. And I really liked that. And I decided to continue the trend in 2024. So I reread 11 books in 2024. And that is twice more than I had in 2023. So 11, it's not a lot, but it's 10% of what I read was a reread. And I enjoyed it so much. Of that, there was 1 reread in English, that was Pride and Prejudice, and there was 10 reread in French. Most of it was fiction, and there were just 2 nonfiction that I reread. But I enjoyed it a lot. So again, that is something I would like to do more of in 2025. That is rereading. Next, let's go more specifically into genres. I have 2 pie charts, one for fiction and one for nonfiction, because if some people say that nonfiction is a genre in and of itself, I disagree because fiction is not a genre in and of itself. So it has categories in it. So in fiction, I decided to subdivide it into various categories. So there's the obvious, such as romance, mystery, science fiction, fantasy. Oh yeah, I read 1 science fiction fantasy in December. I read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. That is science fiction fantasy, so that's 1 for me. And then poetry, theater, and then there's a category I just called graphic. It's graphic novels, but there's just 1 graphic novel. I also included this in that category, and I also included a book that I read for the art readathon, which was a collection of drawings by Sempe with a bit of a caption underneath. So I included that in graphic because it was more about the art than about the writing. So I included that in that category. And anything that didn't quite fit these categories ended up in general literature. So that could include anything that is just a plain novel. That is not a romance, it's not a mystery, it's not poetry, it's not anything else, regardless of when it was published. So if it was published in 1865 or if it was published in 2024, it ended up in the general literature category. So the category that I read the most, without any surprise because I've mentioned it earlier, it is romance. I read 34 romance out of 68 books of fiction that I read this year. That's half of it. It's a lot. And of these 34 romance, 30 were historical romance and only 4 were contemporary romance. And then the next biggest category is general literature with 21 books, and then mystery with 5 books, and then equal, there was category graphic, which is a bit of a made-up category, and poetry with 3 books each. Theater, 2. I read 2 plays. They are Medea by Euripides that I mentioned earlier, and Macbeth by Shakespeare. And then there was 1 collection of short stories and 1 science fiction fantasy. So that's my fiction read this year. In nonfiction, I've divided it a little bit differently than last year because last year my most read category was memoir. And I don't like memoirs. No, it's not true. I do like memoirs, but I like certain types of memoirs. I like memoirs that are about more than the person themselves. So for example, a type of memoir that I love is the travel memoir because it's a bit about the person traveling, but it's mainly about the country that is being visited. It's mainly about the experiences in that country, the differences between that country and the place where the author comes from and things like that. So it's not belly button gazing. So I like that type of memoir. So I decided to classify that not as memoir, but as travel. And in that category of travel, I also included books that were about another place. So that was it really a travel book, or was it journalism, or was it, I don't know, work of anthropology? I didn't really make a difference between all of these types of books if they were about a different country, if the person went there, the author went to that country and either visited or investigated or talked about that country. I decided to include that in travel. Another category was journalism, social issues. So journalism, it's when it's kind of like a history book, but about contemporary affairs. An author who decides to investigate or to research, perhaps research should be a better word, a particular event or a particular situation that is occurring right now or occurred in the last 10 or 15 years. To me, that's not history. So it's about the same type of research that you could do for a biography or for history, but it is about the present. So I decided to include that in journalism and social issues. And that in social issues, that could also include essays. For example, I read an essay about, in French, about is it a word, wokeism? About the woke panic in universities. So that was an essay and about social affairs. And I decided to include together science and nature because sometimes the difference is hard to tell, because a book about nature has a lot of science in it, and a book about science often has a lot of nature in it. So we end up with the following results. The category that I read the most was travel, with 8 books, because it was part of my objectives. At the beginning of the year, I said that I decided to create a challenge for me, a very long-term challenge that could take me 40 years, and I'm fine with that, to read one nonfiction book about every country in the world. And then again, country not necessarily being the only defining, the only way to define the challenge. So about places in the world. So that's the reason why I was interested in travel books this year, and I loved it. So I want to continue that in 2025. So I read 8 travel books. I read 5 history books, 5 memoirs, 8 books of journalism and social issues. So I guess that's equal with a travel. And then 3 biographies and 4 works of science and nature, including a couple that I read for the Booktube prize, but they ended up being very, very good. So I'm happy with that. I'm very happy with that. So that's it for my nonfiction reads of this year. And I have to say that when I was thinking about best books and worst books of the year, it was nonfiction that came up spontaneously in my mind when I was thinking of my year in reading. The best and worst book, they were nonfiction. So I want to continue reading nonfiction because I find it very, very satisfying. A lot more than romance, I have to say. Not that romance is not satisfying, but it gives me like a quick fix, and then I sort of forget about it, and then they get all blurry, and I can't really distinguish when one duke from another and one debutante from another, and it just all becomes a big blur. And that doesn't happen with nonfiction because I read about different topics and things don't get blurred. It's hard to confuse, I don't know, penguins in Antarctica and society in Qatar. I mean, you cannot really confuse those. It's totally different. So that's it for the genres that I read this year. Another interesting statistic is the year of publication, because as I said, I've read Gilgamesh. That's the oldest book that we have that survives. And I also read books that were published in 2024, which is about pretty much the most recent books that we have. So I'm always curious to see the year of original publication, because the translations of Gilgamesh that I read, one of them was brand new from 2023. So that one in a way is a recent book, but Gilgamesh itself is a very old book. So by year of publication and by genre. I just have papers in front of me. I made the graphics a couple of days ago. But if I remember correctly, do I remember correctly? I don't remember correctly at all. I believe nonfiction is in blue and fiction is in red and romance is in pink. But I could be entirely wrong about that, and I can't check the graphics because the graphics are on my phone, which is used for filming right now. But anyway, on the graphic, I will show you right now, there are 3 colors, and one of them is for fiction, one of them is for nonfiction, and one of them is for romance. I decided to separate romance from the rest of fiction because I think it's a different category. I read 3 books that were published in antiquity, so that is before the year 500, and all 3 were fiction. They were poetry and plays. I did not read anything published in the Middle Ages, so between the years 500 and 1500, and then in modern times that I roughly define as being from the year 1500 to 1800, I read 1 play. It was Macbeth. And then in the 19th century, I read 6 books published in the 19th century. One of them was Jane Austen, and the 5 others were French authors. I think I'm going to make a video about that, just the 5 French classics that I read in 2024, or ranking them, or anyway, yeah, I think it's worthy of a video. I'll make a video about that. So that's the 19th century. And then the 20th century, I decided to divide it between the first half and the second half of the 20th century. Why? No particular good reason. Because I guess because 1900 is more than a century away. It's 125 years away by now, so that's starting to become a bit old. Yeah, so books published between 1900 and 1949, I read 7. They were all fiction, 2 of them romance, and 5 of them of general fiction. So the true romance, they were Georgette Heyer. That's it. And then between 1950 and 1999, that's the first time we are seeing some nonfiction. That's a trend that I noticed, that in nonfiction, I read a lot of, I read books that are much more recent. I don't go to classic nonfiction, if I can call it that. I don't tend to. So perhaps it's something I could explore in the coming year, but I won't make it a priority. I'm fine with reading more recent nonfiction. And then, as for fiction in that same period of the second half of the 20th century, I read 2 romance. One of them, again, was a Georgette Heyer. And the other fiction, I read 7, so in the general fiction category. I think that included quite a few rereads. Yeah, that included quite a few rereads. And then the bulk of what I read was published between 2000 and 2021. Why did I decide to stop at 2021? Because at first I grouped 2000 to 2020, and then I decided to count separately for 2021, 22, 23, 24, which was the years I was on Booktube. However, there was only 1 book that was published in 2021 that I read this year, so I thought it did not deserve to have a line of its own. So I included it in the early 21st century category. So I read 7 nonfiction from that period, and I read 19 romance from that period, and 10 other fiction from that period. And then that is for the years 2022, 23, 24, we see something interesting. That is where, particularly in 22 and 23, I did not read a bunch of books published in 2024, but in 22 and 23, that is where we see a spike in nonfiction and a drastic reduction in other fiction, so in general literature. And then romance is rather regular in these 4 years. So in 2022, I read 6 nonfiction, 4 romance, and 1 other fiction. I said in 2021, in 2022 I read this, but no, I meant I read this number of books that were published in 2022. And then again, books published in 2023, I read 15 nonfiction. That's quite a bit. And guess what? It's the Booktube prize. Because in 2024, we judged the books published in 2023. And I judged only 2 rounds this time. I judged the first round and the last round. So I just read 6, and there was 1 book from the first round that made it to the last, so I had 5 books to read in the final, so I just read 11 books for the Booktube prize. So there's 4 books that I read on my own because I felt like it, and not just because I had to because of the Booktube prize. And then 4 romance and 1 other fiction. And then books published in 2024, only 1 nonfiction, 4 romance, and 1 general fiction, and 1 poetry, 1 collection of poetry. I remember it's a collection of poetry that I saw at on the display of new acquisitions at the library, and I just picked it up and I read it. And it was poetry about, it was in French, and the author was from Rwanda, and the back cover sort of said it was a source of memoir in poetry. I did not get the nonfiction aspect of it because it was very poetic and you have to read between the lines, and I think that to read between the lines you have to have a lot of experience in reading poetry, and to see the nonfiction aspect of it you kind of have to know the author and the period in which the author grew up. So I did not get all the nonfiction aspect of it, but as poetry it was quite nice. I kind of like it. So that's it for the publication years. And then we get to the maps. So I did two maps. One where I colored the country of birth of the authors that I've read. So I've read books by authors born in 15 different countries. I don't think it is a relevant statistic because I know, because to get that information in many cases I had to Google it. And in many cases, it doesn't mean anything. It says like, this author born in Denmark while her parents were working there and moved to Sweden when she was 2, or moved to Canada when she was 2. Hey, so Denmark is there. I have one person born in Denmark, but it doesn't mean anything. And same thing if the person is, regardless of where the person is born, if that person decided to write Regency romance, and I read that author's book as a Regency romance, well, the country of birth doesn't count for much. It doesn't appear much in the book that they wrote. So it's worth what it's worth. It's just out of curiosity that I keep that statistics, but I don't give it much importance. So I read authors who were born in 15 different countries. Mainly the United States. 37 books that I read were by authors born in the United States. The United Kingdom, 20 authors that I've read were born in the United Kingdom. France, 15. And one that I give a bit more importance to, it's Canada. So 16 books that I read 16 books by authors who were born in Canada. And I think in all of these cases, it's not just that they were born in Canada, but also that they stayed in Canada, and I can call their books Canadian literature. As far as I remember, I did not read a single romance or even mystery. I don't think I read a Canadian mystery. That was by a Canadian author. The reason I set romance apart, as I said, I read Regency romance. So the idea of keeping stats of where the authors are from, it's a bit to travel in books. And in a Regency romance, you just travel to the UK with very, very few exceptions. You end up in the UK. So it's a fantasy version of the UK in the Regency, so it doesn't really count as that country anyway. For me, it does not bring that aspect of opening myself to the world, which is the only reason why I keep these statistics about the countries that I visit in books. It's about opening my mind to the world, and Regency romance doesn't count as that. At least in my opinion, it just doesn't count. It's just, it's not the same. I read romance for a very different purpose than I read a nonfiction of history or a memoir or something else, or even a work of serious literature, of non-genre literature. Well, non-genre, yeah, general literature, I guess. I don't mean serious in the sense that it needs to have a dramatic ending and that everybody has to die. I mean serious in the sense that it's not necessarily following the formula of a romance or the formula of a mystery. It has a bit more substance to it. Anyway, I'm rambling, so you know what I mean. So I read 16 Canadian authors, and then I read 2 authors who were from Australia, and then 1 each from Antigua, Belgium, China, Denmark, Greece, India, Jamaica, Rwanda, and Sweden. So that's the map. Next, more interesting, I think, is the countries that I visited in books. So for that, the way that I count a country visited, it's simply the setting in a novel or in a nonfiction. If it's about a specific place, then I count it as that place being visited. For example, I read a book that was a travel book, a woman who decided to go to Pitcairn. So it's not a country technically, but I count it as having visited Pitcairn. Same thing, I read a book that was about a lot of things, about penguins in Antarctica and about the first man who observed the penguins in Antarctica. So I count this as having visited Antarctica, even though it doesn't appear on the map because the map does not allow me to click Antarctica. It just counts countries. And also Pitcairn is a teeny tiny island. It's like 1 mile by 1.5 miles. So on the world map, it's not even a dot because the dot would be like 10 miles. So it's just not on the map, but it's on my paper. Also not on the map, I read books that were about the oceans. Again, that's not really, that's not on the map. I cannot click oceans on the map, but I'm going to count it in my countries, source, places visited. So there were 23 countries / places that I visited in 2024. That's fewer than last year. On the map, the color code is rather simple. There is red for, darn, I forgot. There's red for fiction, blue for nonfiction, and if you have purple, it's because I read both a fiction and nonfiction set in that particular country. The countries about which I read the most, there was, it's the regular suspect, I'm going to say. It's the UK, France, Canada, and the United States. It's the 4 countries I always end up reading about and reading books where the action is set. It's just, it always happens. Canada because I'm from Canada, France because I speak French, my first language is French, and United States and United Kingdom because I also read in English, and they are by far the 2 most dominating countries when it comes to publishing books. So that's by default. I read a whole bunch of books that concern the US, the UK, Canada, and France. And then in the other countries that I visited, there's a bit more variety. I did read a book about the USSR, but that was not Russian literature. That was a graphic novel. I read, I don't know if you know the movie, The Death of Stalin. I learned this year that it was based on a graphic novel. So I read the graphic novel. I read it in English because the library has it in English, but it was originally written in French. It happens once in a while that I read a book originally written in French in translation in English. So it's one of the exceptions. So that's why the Russia is, technically it was the USSR at the time, but Stalin died in Moscow, so I just clicked on Russia for the map. But I read a very, very small book for that, but it's a lot of color. Same thing for China. I read a very small book, so Love in a Fallen City. It's a novella, a very good one. I do recommend it, but it's enough to get the entire country colored. And then in no particular order, well, yes, in a particular order, that would be alphabetical order. I read books about Antarctica, Bangladesh, Belgium, about or set in, because I did not read anything about Belgium. It was a book set in Belgium. Bolivia, China, Greece, but then again, it's not modern Greece, it was ancient Greece. I count Medea as by Euripides as being set in Greece. I assume, I don't know, it's a fictitious country, but I'm just going to say it's Greece. And then the French Guiana, Mesopotamia, technically it's Iraq. I clicked the color, the country for Iraq for that, but it was Gilgamesh. It was Gilgamesh and also Agatha Christie, Murder in Mesopotamia. So I clicked Iraq because it's set in Baghdad or somewhere around there, but technically it should be Mesopotamia. So it's a country that doesn't exist anymore. And then Italy, Jamaica, Nepal, Pitcairn, Portugal, Qatar, Rwanda, Sweden, Turkey, and that's it. So that's the map of my reading this year. And that is one of the things with which I am not entirely satisfied. I want to read about more countries, and as I said earlier, I want to read more books in translation. I miss not having read any Russian literature this year. I miss not having read literature from, I don't know, South America or some other place. I miss world literature, either contemporary or classics. I think I prefer to read more classics, and but at the moment, yeah, that's going to be something I want to focus on. What next? Okay, last statistic about the authors that I've read the most. I rarely read the same author multiple times in a row. There are exceptions apparently, and that exception is romance. There are quite a few authors I've read many books, of whom I've read many books, and I think the reason I can do that with romance and I cannot do that with more serious books is that romance, as I said, is kind of a candy. I just gobble it up and I sort of forget it right away. It's a quick rush of dopamine, and because it's very formulaic, and because it is formulaic, and it's a good thing that it's formulaic, that's the reason why I go to that type of book, I can read more of them. It makes it very easy to read and very easy to digest. So there are 4 authors, well, 4 or 5, okay, 6 authors that I read more than one book by. Okay, I'm not sure that is correct English syntax, but we'll live with it. So of these 6, there are 2 that I read 2 books. These are 2 romance authors, Terry Wilson and Julia London. And then there are 2 authors that I've read 3 books. That is Georgette Heyer, another romance author, and Danielle Pennac, the only author of general literature on that list. I've started to reread the series that is called in French the Malheur. In English, I think the first volume is called The Scapegoat. And it's a series of, I don't know, 6, 8 books. And I've read them all, except the most recent ones. That's the thing. The author wrote the original ones in the 1980s and 1990s, and then he put it aside for a couple of decades, and then recently he added to the series. And I haven't read these most recent ones, and I want to read them, but I figured I'm going to reread the first ones before, and they're just so much fun. So I've reread 3 this year, and I want to continue to reread the others in 2025. So 3 by Danielle Pennac, and then I read 5 books by Julianne Long. That is all the Palace of Rogues series. So it's a romance series that I read the books as they come out, basically. And then the author that I discovered this year was Suzanne Enoch. I read 7 books by her, which is enormous. 7 books by the same author in a single year, it's enormous for me. And if we count in number of pages, the top 3 kind of changes. We don't have the same top 3. So in number of pages, the first one remains Susan Enoch, because I read 2,501 pages of her books. And then in number 2, it is Julianne Long with 1,840 pages. And in third place, we get Victor Hugo with a single book, Les Misérables, 1,619 pages. So with just a single book, he raised himself in the top 3. And then in fourth place, it would be Danielle Pennac with over 1,000 pages, 1,028. And then the others would be under 1,000 pages. So the next one would be Georgette Heyer with 933. And then the others, the other 2 authors, I read 2 books by them. The books were rather short. So I think there are other authors with a single book that I read more pages. So I'm just going to leave it to the top 4. So that's that. And I think that's all the statistics that I have. I'm out of statistics. The video is 40 minutes long. It's enough. So with all of these statistics, what am I going to do for next year? So the thing that I realized when I look at all these statistics and what I've read, and did I have a satisfying reading year? And the answer is yes and no, because when I'm going to do my best and worst books of the year in the different videos, because this one is long enough, the best books will have no romance in it. And the worst books will also have no romance in it, because I really, for some reason, for me, that is a part, it barely counts as reading. It's not that I want to diss romance readers. Obviously, I read a lot of it and I enjoy it. But the way I treat these books mentally, I just read them to read them. I just consume them. I gobble them up. And then I forget about them. So these are not books that I use to think, because you can use romance to think about social issues and about society, and you can use it as a springboard for something more serious. But I don't. That's not the way that I use romance books. I just use it to escape and to have a nice story, a happy ending, and okay, just dopamine, and I'm happy. So it's fun while I read it, but at the end of the year, when I reflect on my reading year, they don't bring much. So when it comes to best book or worst book or books you should read, I have a hard time including romance in that because I did not think of these books in that particular way. So does that mean that next year I will read fewer romance? I think so. I may not have as much of a need to read it. And I found that another source of this little dopamine rush was to reread. That was so satisfying. I want to do it more in 2025. So I reread 11 books in 2024. I want to take this to at least 12. So that would be one per month. One reread per month. That's very reasonable statistics, or objective, I should say. Because in rereading, it's faster to reread than to read for the first time. I also want to diversify a little bit my reread because this year, as I said, there was just 2 nonfiction that I reread and most of my rereading was in French. So I may do some rereading in English a bit more. Well, there's going to be Jane Austen July. I've read all of her novels, so that is automatically one reread. But I want to extend it to a little more, to reread more nonfiction, reread more in English, and perhaps read English some nonfiction because that a lot of my nonfiction is in English. I don't have a lot of nonfiction in French. Most of it's in English. So that's a bit the objectives for the year. Earlier this year, as I already mentioned it, earlier in this video, I mentioned that I have this challenge of reading a nonfiction book about every country in the world, country being loosely defined because loosely defined enough to include Pitcairn and to include Antarctica. So this year I read about 5 new places. So books about places about which I had never read before. So that's Pitcairn, Antarctica, Bolivia, Qatar, and there was a 5th one. I knew there was 5. Jamaica. So that was 5. So that's a good number. I want to keep the same number for next year. So I'm going to try to find 5 nonfiction books about countries that I've never read about before. So that excludes Canada, the United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, Japan, Italy, Germany, and anyway, the usual suspects. That excludes all these big countries. I say all these big countries. I've never read anything about Brazil. I've never read anything about India. So these are big countries that I could read something about. I have a nonfiction on my shelf about the Congo. So I want to read that book. It's a translation from the Dutch. The same author also published this year. Well, the English translation was published, well, this year. It's now last year. It's 2024. About Indonesia. It's called Revolusi, and it made the finals for many nonfiction prize. It made the final for the Bailey Gifford. It made the finals for the Kundil Prize, the long list, at least the long list. So it's supposed to be very good, so I could read that for Indonesia. And there are endless possibilities because there are so many countries I haven't read about, and I want to do that. And then again, I define country very loosely. I have a book on the Atlantic that could count. I've read about Antarctica, but I've never read about the Atlantic. I could read about the Atlantic Ocean. Anyway, so that is something I want to continue in 2025. And I think I'm out of things to say for this video. I'm getting very thirsty because I'm not used to speaking for 45 minutes without interruption. I don't know how you who are teachers do that. I'm a translator. I work quietly in front of my computer. I look at stuff and I type, and I'm very happy. So anyway, thank you. If you've made it all the way to this point, you are very patient. Thank you very much. And I don't know how to end a video anymore, so that's proof I need to make more videos. So thank you everyone for watching, and I will see you in the next video. À la prochaine!